In this way of implementing it more locally, it uses your Bluetooth radio that can only go up to 20, 50 meters. If you had a phone and I had a phone, right now I could transmit something to you and that's it. That's actually as private as you can get, especially if we're putting encryption over that connection. So it's just me and you having our devices talk to each other. But I think that what really needs to happen, especially as we're looking at governments providing this as a service for citizens and residents, we need to think about what are the policies to support it. We can build all the technology that we want and have these great privacy features, right? But unless there's a mandate, that's how we do it, right? We run the risk of things not totally going that way.
You are listening to the Connected podcast coming to you from the heart of Taipei, in which we get personal on news and issues that connect us all, both in Taiwan and around the world. I'm Tomasz Koper, and I know this will come as a shock to you, but I hate bureaucracy. But in case you're on the fence, just think back to the last time you had to wait at your local DMV to get your driver's license updated. And the work our guest today is doing promises to cut some of that red tape and streamline interactions with bureaucracy through digital IDs, passes, and permits that can be used both by governments and enterprises. Wayne Chang, the founder and CEO of SpruceID. Great to have you on the show. Thanks for doing this.
Great to be here.
Well, we've had connected networks of computers for decades now. And that always had the promise of having everything kind of digitized. You know, you have your digital IDs, digital passes, permits, what have you. But it is now 2025, and we're still hearing about these kind of projects as news. So why aren't we seeing more of that? Or why aren't we there yet alongside, hoverboards and flying cars? Why are we still waiting for digital IDs?
Yeah, identity is a really complex topic. That term itself is extremely overloaded. Depending on where you find that definition, there's a bunch of different ways to describe identity. Everything from more humanitarian leaning, what is your identity, what do you identify as, to very technical definitions like the International Standards Organization. They have a definition that says identity are attributes related to an entity, which could be anything, right? It could be a IoT device, it could be you, it could be anything, right? And I think for the broadest, most useful definition I've encountered is identity is the way that we recognize, remember, and respond to people and things, right? So how do people recognize who you are? How do they remember that context for you? And then how do they basically respond to that, right? So if you show up to a DMV, how do they know that's Tomasz? How do they remember, oh yeah, you are a driver in the state? And then how do they decide to help you renew your license or not, right? So there's this process associated with using identity that's really contextual, actually. And we've had many evolutions of this online in how we recognize, remember, and respond to people and things. And we need to keep evolving it. A lot of these systems were ad hoc, designed for logging into your Facebook account or your email, right? And these were just leveraged for other use cases. Hey, why don't we also log into this website since you already have this login or something else, right? So we extended these systems. This is also why DMVs in the United States and Australia and some other places also double up as your identification.
Right.
So your driver's license is not just your driving privilege, but also it serves as identification, right? Because everyone had one. It was kind of, an happenstance of convenience. Just like how you can sign into websites with your Facebook account or Google account, your Apple account. It just so happens that those systems operate at scale. They have a ton of security engineers to keep things safe. They work pretty conveniently, right? And they can be used to satisfy some parts of your identity when you're doing some activities. But depending on the activity, you might have different requirements, right? So I'd say that digital identity has already been evolving in how we access the internet and services, right? It's just kind of what is the role of the state as we start to modernize. And the identity that the state issues also has digital representations.
So what are some of the issues that you see with the current systems in place that deal with digital IDs? You mentioned teams of engineers that keep things safe and things running relatively smoothly. So what kind of issues are there that we can still solve with digital IDs?
Well, I think that one of the big issues is more of a societal or political issue where basically there's a social contract for using these tools, right? And we really need an opportunity for societies to think about, well, how should we have such a system? Instead of just, copy pasting and extending what already exists to other use cases. What are basically constitutional approaches to building digital identity? What are the protections that we would expect for such a thing? Today, we have our plastic ID cards, and when you use them in places, for the most part, the issuer of those IDs don't track you, right? So, but when you make things digital, it's so much easier to do that. So what are, the expectations around privacy, around individual control, around how you can disclose information and keep your privacy?
Well, I was about to say it's not necessarily a good thing that a digital ID can be tracked more easily than a physical ID.
Yeah, and I think that when you move things digital, everything just gets a lot easier.
Well, speaking of architectures and how various systems are designed, there are countries that are doing more in that space, and one of them is Estonia. We recently had the pleasure of having the former president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, on our show talking about this digitization, and he kind of explained to us how the Estonian system was designed, the kind of just bird's eye view of their architecture. So I want you to listen to that, and then we'll discuss if that model is still viable in 2025.
What was uniquely Estonian was the something we now call the X Road, but it's a distributed data exchange system. We don't have data all in one place. Nor do we even have, sort of sections here, sections there. What we have is every kind of data that relates to you is unique somewhere. I mean, think of this room as full of these little Christmas tree balls. And one ball would be my healthcare data. Another one would be my driving license data, and another one would be my tax data. And so they're all individually stored, or at least accessible. So only I can access my medical records, and my doctor is the only one he's the other one who can access it. The police can't access my medical records. My doctor can't look at my tax records. So if you put the system together, it becomes very secure. The worst that will happen would be a single cell that's gone. Now, the counterexample to this, and the disaster that we were trying to avoid, actually befell the United States government in 2015 with what is called now the OPM, or the Office of Personnel Management hack, in which the United States stored all records of all federal employees. I think in total it's up to some 23 million records of people in one place. This included things such as the home address of FBI agents. Well, you couldn't do that with us. There's no way you could get that because it's all over the place.
I saw you nodding there when President Ilves mentioned the OPM hack. So that, I assume, was a big story in the space that still resonates to this day.
The OPM hack is a story that is continuously repeated in privacy circles, and I think rightfully so. And to me, I see it as evidence that you might have organizations that are good at key management, managing these cryptographic private keys and rotating them. And sometimes you have staff with suitcases go in person to rotate the key with military-like precision, because the Department of Defense actually does a lot of it. Governments have a track record of being able to do that well, and large organizations as well. What I don't think many, if any, organizations have a good track record of doing at scale is managing huge data silos and preventing any breaches. Right. So if you have lots of data in the same place, we find that more and more they get breached. And we see this on the news every week in terms of photos of driver's licenses collected to prove age that are leaked by the tens of thousands, to government agencies that lose all these records, to large enterprises that just get their whole corporate archives unleashed, right? And that has been demonstrated to be a really, really difficult thing to protect. So I actually really agree with this idea of decentralizing where the data are stored.
But one of the big methods of decentralizing data storage and verification is blockchain. But that technology, as far as I know, is limited in how much data it can carry. Do you think that there will not be a need for having like centralized data storage, like not even databases, but just data repositories for things that aren't very, they can be compressed to a small enough size to, for example, put on the blockchain? I'm thinking, deeds to a house with detailed maps and, all of that stuff.
So blockchains are very interesting as a tool. And even Estonia has a blockchain that they've developed to help secure the access to data records, right? So I think that it is a form of a database that has great properties related to censorship resistance. You get really auditable trail of how different records have entered the system and have updated. And that's why it's useful for things like payments, for assets, and a bunch of other things. I think that it plays a role as a tool in identity systems that can be very resilient, and data systems too. So if, for example, I want to back up large archives of data somehow, and I want to know it's coordinated across 3 different websites, I need a coordinating layer that tells me what each archive is at in terms of its synchronization to the most recent copy, right? That might be a good tool for the so-called control plane to coordinate a bunch of this stuff, especially if I have requirements that this must be a highly resilient layer that many people on the public internet must be able to access. I'd say that's a really good use case. Other use cases that I think are really promising, and this is going to be a little forward thinking, but to extend on what the former president talked about in terms of being able to control access to one's data, right? And by the way, this is very consistent with Helle Nissenbaum's definition of privacy, which is appropriate control over data flows, right? You decide that your health records go to your doctor, and maybe they can refer it to a specialist that you approved, right? And no more, right? And being able to control those flows is critical for you to achieve privacy. In fact, I think that privacy is a side effect of having digital autonomy. If you have proper control over your data and its flows, then you get privacy for free, right? So that's how I think about it in terms of how do we build individual freedoms into the digital world. Now you get privacy as part of that. So I think that in terms of being able to exercise that control, one of the tough points about implementing privacy regulations like GDPR from the Europeans is the automated enforcement of those rights. If you have data privacy rights, but your way to enforce your rights is to write an email, right? And maybe one day we'll have an AI agent do it for you and a bunch of things, right? I think that being able to do it automatically and being able to inventory all the data that you've ever shared with any website or counterparty and what rights you have to exercise based on where your residency is or how those companies and individuals are subject to different requirements, that takes a whole legal team to figure out today, and a bunch of emails and a bunch of elbow grease, right? So to the extent that protocols and technologies can help you automatically manage that process, that can actually return a lot of privacy to individuals. And one approach that we're excited about is this idea of having personal data licenses, where as you basically share data, you're signing off on what the data was shared for, right? So you're at your doctor's, you're like, yep, you can see my immunization history, right? And you sign off on sharing that to your doctor for a year under the CCPA in California, let's say, right? And they can share it to a specialist. This stuff needs to be encoded in a way that humans and machines can read, right? So that it's really easy for everyone to see if they're following the rules with your data. And then you need to be able to further exercise your rights through it, right? So if we run into this requirement where you're trying to exercise your rights and you're trying to revoke the data license, as is your right, then how do you do that? Do you have to run your private personal server and pay for all that overhead to maintain the ability to update that? Or can you send a small update that costs less than a penny to a globally available, immutable ledger of different exercise of rights, right? So this is a really good use case for how individuals can leverage a common resource that already exists in the world that has those nice properties to be able to effectuate privacy policy.
I watched your video in which we kind of talked about this almost reversal of the typical hierarchy in digital architectures. So instead of the user signing into a service, the service is signing into a data repository that the user controls, and then the user only chooses to share only the relevant information instead of giving, your Facebooks and your Googles sort of access to everything that you do online. But that would, I imagine, require rethinking the way a lot of our internet is already designed, like the structures that are already in place. Do you think that this is feasible? Is this a realistic goal?
I think it certainly is. The mission of the company is to let people control their data across the web. And instead of people signing into platforms should ask you for permission to access your stuff, and you should have full discretion over that, right? So I think that we're seeing a moment where we're starting to find architectures that fit this description. For example, we work on the mobile driver's license program in California. We do work for the California DMV. They're really forward-looking and innovative in terms of how they provide utility, privacy, and security for Californians. And the idea is simple. It's the driver's license on your phone, right? That way you can use it for a bunch of use cases that you typically would need your physical wallet for, but it's much easier and it can be more private because it's on your phone. And how those systems work is not have everything in a big central server controlled by an entity, but rather we're going to return the data to the user's devices directly, right? So it's going to be a digitally signed payload. You can put it onto your phone, and now you can decide when to use it, right? So I think that this fits this model of a data vault that you control.
What happens if you lose your phone? Would you have to go through every single office that you have an ID or license or permit with and kind of have those reissued? Or would you have, again, the package that you mentioned, the vault that you just get, again, on your new phone, let's say, from one centralized place?
That's a great question. And right now, the ecosystem is developing. But right now, for the mobile driver's license and other, we'll call them high assurance credentials, they're really confident ways to demonstrate you are you, right? And for these, I imagine that getting another one should have some friction and increased security associated with it, because we don't want just anyone being able to say, hey, I'm going to get the Tomasz credential and start emptying the bank accounts. Right?
Oh, please don't do that.
Yeah,
although you won't find much in that account.
Okay, maybe we'll talk about crypto too. But basically, being able to add the right level of security and friction to that is going to be really important to keep everyone's credential safe. So for that credential, maybe it does look like you have to go to the office, maybe in person, maybe remotely. There are different ways to get to the level of assurance that you need. And if you have that, then maybe you can get your fishing license or your camping permit or anything else that you need as a credential, right, on your device after proving with this main credential. These models where we have trade-offs between what's the usability versus the security, really, really important.
I imagine to make all of this possible, you need to get the users on board. You need to convince people to adopt these things. So once again, I want to bring in Estonia's former president, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, with his take on how to make that happen in a society.
Building a robust e-government system did not happen overnight in Estonia. What would you say is the lessons that Taiwan can learn from Estonia so it doesn't have to go through growing pains?
Focus first on the kind of services that lots of people use that they don't like doing. It's taxes. I mean, okay, you've done that, that's good. But I mean, things that lots of people use that are in a paper world are inconvenient, and then but in a digital world you can make very convenient. So again, digital prescription.
So where did you identify, where do you see the biggest potential for digital IDs and just the associated systems that you were talking about?
I think focusing on what gives people utility is key, right? Make something people want. I think that's critical. And I'm really glad to hear someone who was appointed to office talk that way. It's refreshing. And I think that if you look in the United States, the largest requirement for digital identity set federally is the financial sector.
Right.
And being able to get a bank account, being able to access benefits from the government, being able to have credit, get loans, things of that nature, all require identity because we're really trying to mitigate fraud, right? Fraudsters and criminals basically getting the money to the wrong place, emptying bank accounts, et cetera. So that's where a lot of the identification requirements are set, right? And I think that being able to let people have access to those services very conveniently and giving them increased ability to trust that the system's not going to send all their money to a different account because their account got password reset or something and, a whole bunch of terrible things happened. I think that really increases utility for people and makes it really easy. And besides, think about the last time that you were on your phone and it told you, hey, we need you to take a picture of your driver's license or your passport or anything else so that you can continue, whether that's ordering groceries online, whether that's trying to open an account somewhere or anything else. That's the current state of the art today. I think that another increasing force since you had that interview is the rise of AI deepfakes.
Right.
People being able to generate your likeness with AI, including you holding a picture of your driver's license in front of the camera. Already, it was kind of a hack to take pictures of driver's licenses and say that's inspecting it, right? Think about the physical security features on a driver's license, the holograms, the UV activated ink. There's no UV rays in most webcams, right? So to hold it into a webcam in a shoddy lighting condition and expect that that's going to, do the full security inspection, it's really, really difficult. So being able to understand that this approach is kind of going to be on the way of the dinosaurs, right? Because the AI is going to get good enough to be able to make fake stuff and fool it. We need to move to things that AI can't do. AI can't break cryptography to our knowledge. It can't really show up in person that well. I've seen the new Neo videos and it's interesting, but we're not going to fool someone that that's actually the person anytime soon. And it can't do complex predictions with physics where you're refracting light off of something. You literally have to do these computations. You're expecting a certain value. There are a whole class of things called liveness checks that use statistical methods to see if that is a real human in front of a camera or a rubber mask or an AI deepfake. So these are things that AIs are not good at. And we need to build the new security models on top of these systems. And things like digital credentials allow us to have those. Verifiable digital credentials define a class of technologies that allow you to have this digitally signed package on your device or in your cloud wallet or somewhere that you can control. And you can demonstrate that to a counterparty called a verifier.
And well, one of the key takeaways for me when I was preparing for this was that the verification would happen locally without necessarily any kind of connectivity to a centralized database. So let's say I get stopped by the police and they want to check my ID, but I'm in the middle of nowhere and there's no internet. I can still show them my credentials and they can check it locally without having to connect to a database. That is the plan, right? That is the dream.
Yeah, that is one way to implement it. And it is the way that we strongly recommend, right? It is not the path that everyone chooses to implement it. And in this way of implementing it more locally, it uses your Bluetooth radio that can only go up to 20, 50 meters, right? So it's not sending things to a faraway server. You can transmit that peer-to-peer. If you had a phone and I had a phone, right now I could transmit something to you and that's it. That's actually as private as you can get, especially if we're putting encryption over that connection. So it's just me and you having our devices talk to each other. That I really advocate for as, let's start from there. But I think that what really needs to happen, especially as we're looking at governments providing this as a service for citizens and residents, we need to think about what are the policies to support it. We can build all the technology that we want and have these great privacy features, right? But unless there's a mandate, that's how we do it, right? We run the risk of things not totally going that way. How
difficult is it for you to convince politicians, convince elected officials that this is the way to go? Are they receptive to these ideas? A lot of them are more advanced in age, usually is the case in most countries.
I think that the biggest gap is people actually understanding more about the technology among the stacks of other papers that they have to deal with. A politician has to think about so many different topics, everything from the environment to social welfare to defense spending to cybersecurity, right? This is one of those topics competing for their attention. And I think that if they and their staffers spend more time on it to understand what is become of it, I've actually seen really strong across the aisle support in the United States for the approach where we're just empowering the end user, right? Because how does a user access data? Do we create large databases on U.S. people, right? And I've just gotten resounding no's from politicians across the board.
Yeah.
Right, when you start framing it that way. And that's literally kind of some of the decisions, right? So figuring out how to add the protections at the policy level is super important. A really great example of this is recently in Utah. They passed Senate Bill 260, which was signed into law earlier this spring by Governor Cox. And the bill is called state-endorsed digital identity. And the premise of the bill is that the state doesn't issue your identity, Tomasz. Your parents already named you, and your community recognizes who you are, right? And whatever the state may give, it can also take, right? So we think that it's not appropriate for the state to define who you are as a human. Instead, the state can endorse your identity in a way that is useful to you to access government services, the financial sector, a whole bunch of other use cases. You have to meet the state's requirements. This goes back to the security and the proofing to do that. But if the state does it, it's not going to track you. It's not going to force you to hand over your phone. It's not going to force you to use the digital identity system. You can always use a paper or plastic one if you so choose, right? That's literally in the law, right? And this law defines what is state-endorsed digital identity, meaning that this will apply to future programs, if any, that support digital identity. This is a constitutionally inspired approach. These are your rights in the digital world, right? With respect to digital identity, it binds future systems to adhere to these requirements, right? And I think it's really powerful. We've seen a lot of interest from other states in this model, considering how do we do a better job of protecting people's rights in the digital world. And I think it starts with identity and being really thoughtful about that. Instead of just gluing on another piece, or can we use this existing system in a new way over here and just kind of ask people if they want to use it because it's easy, but really doing the hard thinking of what should we expect from such a system, and what are the protections, what are the architectures, what are the policies that support it, and have that work in tandem with the technology. Because although we have the policy, as we mentioned about the GDPR and other privacy regulation, that doesn't have automatic enforcement, right? The policy itself is not enough, just like the technology by itself is not enough. We need to figure out how the technology supports the implementation of the policy and really is able to have its spirit, throughout future identity systems.
I imagine these systems will have to be highly compatible, well, obviously within the system, but also between them to a certain degree. So we need interoperability, we need standardization, but currently there are different organizations working within that space. We have ISO, we have W3C, we have the European one, which is a little embarrassing that I don't remember the name of that one or the acronym.
The Architectural Reference Framework?
Yes, exactly.
Okay,
yeah, thank you. I am European. I should know this first. So are these organizations currently kind of working or even thinking about developing a shared standard, a shared way of handling all of that, the different kind of digital ID formats and issuers and the variety, absolute deluge of different kind of documents that we might all sort of carry on our phones in the future whenever there's a need to kind of go beyond one system and paramedics having to look at my driver's license, for example.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different protocols and data formats that you can use to represent these so-called verifiable digital credentials, right? And they don't all work with each other directly, right? So that creates a challenge when we're trying to build these systems. Which one do I pick? Betamax or VHS, right? That was the age-old one. And then there was Blu-ray and HD DVD. And I think that
in all those cases, though, one emerged successful. That's why we have or used to have VHSs, not Betamax at homes. Do you think that a similar process will happen with digital identity, where the community kind of settles on one standard for one reason or another, or is this going to be a continued kind of issue?
I think it's looking to be maybe 3 to 4.
Okay.
Yeah, right now, I think that two are kind of dominant, but I wouldn't say it's 20, and thank goodness for that. But hopefully, the layperson who just wants to use the system never has to think about that.
Okay.
Right. In California, we support two different kinds of data formats, a variety of protocols, right? And we just make sure that the credential we issue supports many of them, because our focus is how do we deliver utility with the right privacy, security, and sustainability? Is it useful? Can we get back to the use cases? Can you board an airplane with it? Can you one day open a bank account with it? And all these other things that people need to go about their lives. And then making sure we only ship systems that meet the security requirements and privacy requirements. And thirdly, how do we make sure that there's an actual ecosystem of support for this? So there's not just one vendor that can do everything for everyone, right? But if, the Veterans Affairs Department, which also issues a photo ID, wants to issue an identity, right? Can they more or less do it on the same terms as the DMV or any other agency, and it just works? I think that this framework where you have many sources of identity and not a singular one, back to sort of the OPM hack, is a really important point. You should be able to get identity issued by agencies if they follow the right steps, if they really make sure that's a real person, and then they have all this right security controls to give you that digital credential in the wallet that you pick, right? And the wallet that you pick, you should have choice. The wallets might have some certain requirements to meet, like they have to do privacy this way or security another way. But I think I'm fundamentally in support of giving users more choice.
You said that VDCs are a family of technologies, a group of different technologies. And while a lot of people think of blockchain as a possible savior of privacy and sort of the driver of the push for digitization of a lot of different things that we now do either in the physical world or online, in less secure ways. Where does that come in the security space?
It's a great question. So I think one of the most underappreciated contributions of the blockchain ecosystem to digital identity is the world of zero-knowledge proofs, advanced forms of mathematics and cryptography that allows you to prove facts about yourself without disclosing specific facts, right? The really sort of basic example that people give is you can prove you're over 18 without giving your date of birth, but a lot more is actually possible. Like if you're using financial services, you might want to show that, hey, I'm not on a list of designated individuals that you can't do any transactions with.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you who I am, but I can convince you I'm not on that list, right? So that is sort of the minimal amount of information you needed to disclose for that interaction, and that's it. And that's why it's called zero knowledge, right? And no industry has kind of pushed the state of the art further than blockchains. And the level of investments and new technologies coming out of there around cryptography, it's been critical. Google recently released a library called Longfellow, which retrofits the zero-knowledge technology to mobile driver's licenses. So you can prove things without sharing unique values like digital signatures. To do that, they relied upon technologies that came out of the blockchain ecosystem, namely Ligero and some other building blocks. And I think that it has really moved that mentality forward. And you also find a lot of people who just care about having individual control in the digital world. I actually think that from the market and business perspective, the digital assets ecosystem will be a huge driver towards returning control to individuals in terms of data even. So as I mentioned, financial regulations are some of the biggest sources of identity requirements. Right. And right now, there's been a really wonderful speech by Hester Peirce, who is a commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission. You can look it up. It's called Peanut Butter and Watermelon. It's very memorable. And her whole point in her speech was that when she was a child, she really hated watermelon. But, that was what the family ate. So her grandfather would try to smear peanut butter on the watermelon to make it more palpable. Right. And they basically were known as like the family that did that because it was such a strange thing, right? But when she basically talked to the operator, this was a world where there were operators doing switching services for telephones, right? The operator would know.
For our younger viewers, a telephone is like your smartphone, but with a cord.
Yeah, and a person in the middle.
And a person.
At some point, yeah. And they're like, hey, aren't you the peanut butter and watermelon family, right? And that was definitely like what security experts would call today a man in the middle, right? So when we moved to automated switching services, we saw the potential for increased privacy. right? So as we upgrade towards digital assets that are automated and more peer-to-peer, actually this is an opportunity to reclaim a lot of privacy versus reporting every facet of your life to a financial institution, being able to go about the sector without it. So it's a really, really great speech and a great read. And we just had the Genius Act passed in the US that talked about how stablecoins are managed and regulated. It's a really great opportunity to shift to some of these more privacy-preserving technologies. Instead of uploading a whole picture of your passport and sending in really, really intrusive details about yourself, right? What are ways to use credentials to disclose just exactly what they need and nothing more?
I know blockchain can be like really good for privacy, but one of the criticism that is kind of leveled against digital IDs in general or digitizing too much is that on one hand, yes, there is kind of robust security baked into the technology, at least if we go with blockchain. On the other hand, anything that is digitized can be tracked more easily than, a paper permit or a physical plastic ID. Do you think that we will be able to either build systems that will kind of resist those attempts, or do you think governments will resist the temptation to do it anyway?
I think we can definitely build those systems. There is no technical limitation to that, right? I think it's in the policy landscape about what you find important as a society, right? And I always like the framework of vote on values and bet on beliefs, or, look to market solutions to find out how to implement those policies, right? So I think what's really required is saying that, hey, we actually care a lot about when you work with your digital identity and you use it around the world, that can't create this breadcrumb that can ultimately track your entire history to some attacker. And if the government can see it, can they get hacked and then someone else can see it, right? And which government is it? I think that's a big thing too. People just talk about the government as if it's like this big entity. But in the United States anyway, it's a bunch of different entities. There's state level governments, local governments,
foreign governments.
Yeah. So which government, right? So, if you can't agree on that, then I think one thing that you can agree on is, okay, all right, let's just give more autonomy to the individual and let them be more free in their day-to-day. So I think those systems are definitely possible to build, especially using things like zero-knowledge technology. But we need to see it enshrined in the legislature and the policies that govern these systems, right? And I think that there is not enough engagement of civic society. When one day you can just put your ID on your phone magically and you don't know too much about it, right? I think it's actually very appropriate for someone to feel very skeptical about that. Well, what is this? Is it going to be tracked when I use it? Why am I being asked to use this when I'm like on some websites, that are asking if I'm over 18, right? And people have a big aversion to this stuff. And if they don't know anything about it and this is how they're presented, that concept, it's no surprise, right? So I think upfront engagement about what is digital ID, what are things that we should allow for it or not, and actually building that into the public consciousness if it is important enough of an issue, and I think it is, I think that's actually really necessary. So if I were, thinking about what a government could do if they really wanted to give people control over their data in a user-controlled identity fashion, right? I think public engagement is one of the best bang for buck that you can do.
And I really appreciated that when I visited your website, instead of, just having the introductions about us and all of that, there was a very robust section that was just education about the technology. People need to kind of know more and understand more about the technology. So I do appreciate that you do that. But with the general population, I think blockchain as a technology, even though it's kind of agnostic towards how it's being used most of the time, it is in most people's minds connected to cryptocurrencies, and it might have suffered reputational damage because of the sort of ups and downs of the crypto market and the general attitudes towards cryptocurrencies and all the meme coins floating around and all of that. Do you think that blockchain can break out of that immediate connection in people's minds between it and cryptocurrencies?
I think that people won't have to think about cryptocurrencies or blockchains as we see the next generation of basically digital assets come to fruition. We're starting to see some major players start incorporating stablecoins into, their workflows. And I think that their product managers would basically have a conniption if you ask them to explain crypto blockchain when this person's just trying to buy a cup of coffee, right? So I think the UX will figure out itself. When we use credit cards, we don't think about the EMV encryption tokens used inside the chips. We don't think about like, okay, this is going to that server and there's the merchant acquirer bank and they take the liability, right? These are kind of like credit card nerd things that just kind of aren't in the public consciousness. People just know that you tap to pay and it's great.
Well, there are other criticisms against sort of using blockchain. One of them is the comparative environmental impact compared to some of the more straightforward technologies that don't require as much encryption. Is that improving? Is that going to be a problem the more people and governments and companies adopt digital IDs and use blockchain for identity recognition?
One thing to really clarify around blockchains and identity, identity systems can exist without a blockchain entirely, right? So they're just really traditional computing systems, but sometimes you might want a blockchain for some certain properties. Like if you're trying to design a really resilient identity system that is administered by the current government, but even if the government no longer exists, the identity system can continue to operate, right? Like those are the architectures possible when you involve a public resilient blockchain as part of it in the actual identity provisioning of it. Now, using the identity may again involve blockchains if you're interacting with digital assets. So there are a bunch of ways where they tie in. So it makes it a pretty complex topic. But the environmental impact of blockchains, as many chains have moved off of proof of work, including Ethereum, which is one of the main chains used for digital assets, right? And we move to these proof of stake systems that are way more efficient from an energy perspective. I think that it just keeps getting better and scalable, comparable to regular financial systems in terms of energy consumption to transactions processed. Probably always will be a bit less efficient from the energy consumption and computing consumption perspective because all the extra checks that we do to make sure that every transaction can be standalone, consistent, and it's not just one simple database. I would also say, though, that from the macro perspective, the amount of energy consumed entirely by Bitcoin and other proof of work networks really pales in comparison to things like AI factories that are generating, lots of LLM computations and training sets, pales in comparison to a bunch of really heavy energy requirements like reindustrialization and manufacturing that's coming back, right? So it's like, okay, out of all the different, energy consuming industries, how high is this in our priority list?
I remember a time long ago, maybe last year, when we were talking about blockchain as like, having great environmental impact. And yes, AI data centers completely took that topic.
But I'm hearing none of the same people complain about it. So it's curious.
It's true. Yeah. But definitely not as big of an issue in comparison with what's happening.
I think that there's a term from philosophy called animal instinct where people just believe something and then they come up with logic towards the belief, right? And many great discoveries are made this way. A lot of physicists are like, I got a hunch, right, that this is possible. I just need to find the math to get there, right? And I think it can be used in arguments too, where someone says, I think this thing is great, or I think this thing is bad. And then you find the logic to support it, right? And really, really smart people can come up with a lot of logic that makes sense. So I think that it's, that's why talking about controversial topics is so difficult. I think fortunately now it seems a lot less controversial that major parts of the economy are going to just run on blockchains. We saw stablecoin issuance go from like 5 billion just a few years ago of outstanding USD on-chain to I think over 250 billion now with regulatory clarity, which the industry hasn't had for many years. Now I think it's going to accelerate even more. And for me, it's about efficiency and control and having the security that we need for a financial system in the 21st century. So if you think about how you do a payment on a blockchain, it's really like tearing it down to the core essential of what a payment is. We're going to make it pretty affordable. We're going to make it clear really quickly, and it's going to be auditable and secure. All the other stuff, we're not going to have it in the beginning, right? So things like privacy, you can see all the transactions and their amounts if you send a naive transaction on a public blockchain, right? We're not going to have reversibility, the ability to charge back, right? We're not going to have dispute resolution. These are all the things that go into that 3% fee that people use when they pay credit cards. Point systems, airport lounge access, right? We layered so much stuff into the payment. And so to tear it all the way down to something that is as cheap, fast, and efficient as you can get it at the expense of all these other properties, I think that is the real disruptive innovation. And the magic here is the composability, because you can add back all those things. and you can, like a dim sum menu, and there's some amazing dim sum in Taiwan. So you can just add back piece by piece what you actually need for the transaction, and you don't have to pay the full price every time, right? It's kind of like perfectly balanced for what you want to do, but you have to be thoughtful about how you construct that. And that's how I see the role of identity, right? For some transactions, especially when there are things like sanctions or anti-fraud or anti-money laundering regulations to be concerned about and comply with, you need to add some aspect of identity. But you don't need to add the whole hog. You need to think, what does the rule actually require? And what is the risk that we're trying to mitigate? And how do we meet that efficiently?
Blockchain, as you say, has been becoming more and more efficient. And I think sooner or later, it's already happening, but it will get kind of like separated in people's minds from, the early cryptocurrencies. So hopefully we'll see a change. But speaking of changes, you come to Taiwan pretty regularly, both for business and to visit your family. I'm sure you interact with some digital services or digitized services. How do you assess Taiwan's progress on this kind of like digitization path? What is Taiwan doing right and what still needs a bit of work?
I don't actually, as a visitor, use that many digital services in Taiwan. In fact, the MRT card is so convenient.
That's true, yeah.
Right? And I think that cash is still widely used, and most places accept the credit card that I use. So I'd say that like a lot of the services I access as a sort of a foreigner, not so heavily reliant on government services. However, I had the privilege of talking to some members of the government, of folks working with the government and trying to improve digital government. I think that the really interesting part is the level of thoughtfulness that's been going into it and how aligned it is with basically creating more individual freedoms. And there seems to be from the public, I watched some of your other video clips around digital identity, right? A skepticism around digital identity or like, if it's convenient, then I'll use it. And that's kind of the different attitudes that we find around the world when we start talking to those users. And I think that for the Taiwan government with their digital wallet project, I think that thinking about the decentralized way of doing it, right, and how do we make sure that we're enshrining the rights of the individual in a way that the technology can support, that is something that I really like what I'm seeing.
It is a weird mix of like, people being cautious about new technologies and the role of government in how they use their own data on one hand, and on the other hand, they will jump on a new service as long as it's convenient. Like, oh yeah, sure. My whole medical record in an app on my phone, sign me up.
I think it's great that there are people skeptical of the technology. In fact, the more I learn about technology, the more skeptical I get about it. And you always have to gyrate between, we can like improve this and make it better for people to, I want to live in the woods, right? But I think that it's important to work on things that you care about towards the mission that you think is important. I think that for skeptics of the technology, right, I think one really important argument to consider is that ready or not, here it comes, right? We're going to be in a digital world and it's going to just keep accelerating, right? So if that's the case and you're going to have a digital identity, whether you like it or not, it might be someone else's system that doesn't even tell you have a digital identity, but then it's your digital identity, right? And you can't stop it because that's kind of the rising tide of the force, unless you find a way to stall all progress, and you might agree on a moratorium or something for that. But in terms of economic development, it would be devastating. So that's not a very politically popular argument, right? So if it's going to be here and we agree with that premise, then do you want it to happen on your terms, right? Do you want to have your voice into how it's built, or do you want it to just be decided for you, right? So I think that's why engagement for people who care about this topic is so important.
Yeah, and we need both proponents and skeptics of the technology. Thank you very much for this conversation, Wayne Chang, founder and CEO of SpruceID.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
And to our viewers, are you a skeptic or a proponent of digital IDs where you live? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're down there, check out our main show, Connected on Taiwan Plus. You can find it on our YouTube channel and the Taiwan Plus website. I'm Tomasz Koper. Until next time.